Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula, ruled Rome from March 37 to January 41 CE. At first celebrated as the son of the beloved general Germanicus, his reign quickly descended into fear and chaos. Ancient accounts describe him as extravagant and cruel. He drained the imperial treasury with lavish games, spectacles, and public works, then turned to heavy taxes and confiscations to fund his lifestyle. He declared himself divine, ordered temples to display his image, and mocked the Senate, humiliating its members and, according to some sources, threatening to make his horse a consul. Executions and banishments followed, with senators, nobles, and even relatives falling victim to his unpredictable wrath. His rule grew so unbearable that the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, struck him down on January 24, 41 CE, killing him inside the palace. His wife, Milonia Caesonia, and their daughter were also murdered in the purge. Though his reign lasted less than 4 years, Caligula's legacy endures as one of Rome's most notorious emperors, remembered not for achievements, but for terror, excess, and the dangers of absolute power. Nero, emperor of Rome from 54 to 68 CE, rose to power at just 16 under the shadow of his mother, Agrippina, and the guidance of Seneca. His reign began with promise, but it soon descended into tyranny, extravagance, and bloodshed. In 59 CE, Nero orchestrated the murder of Agrippina, eliminating the mother who once secured his throne. 3 years later, in 62 CE, his wife Octavia was banished and executed, further cementing his reputation for cruelty. Then came the Great Fire of Rome in July 64 CE. The inferno consumed much of the city for days, and although accounts differ, suspicion turned toward Nero. To deflect blame, he accused the Christians, subjecting them to brutal executions, torn apart by dogs, crucified, and burned as human torches. Even as Rome reeled, Nero indulged his obsession with performance, forcing the empire's elite to witness him on stage. But his excess and paranoia fractured his support. By 68 CE, rebellion spread. The Senate declared him an enemy, and abandoned by all, Nero took his own life. His final words echoed his vanity: "What an artist dies in me." Thus ended the reign of one of history's most infamous emperors, remembered as much for spectacle as for terror. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, ruled Rome from 177 to 192 CE, and became sole emperor after his father died in 180. His reign marked the collapse of nearly a century of stability under the Antonine dynasty. Obsessed with power and spectacle, he declared himself the living Hercules, donning a lion's skin, and even stepping into the Colosseum to fight as a gladiator. To the Roman elite, this was both scandalous and degrading for the office of emperor. Paranoia shaped his rule. After a failed assassination plot in 182, led by his sister Lucilla, Commodus unleashed brutal purges, executing senators and consolidating his control. His megalomania deepened. He renamed Rome itself, Colonia Commodiana, renamed the months after his titles, and demanded worship as a god. On December 31, 1920 CE, his own inner circle turned against him. After poison failed, his wrestling partner Narcissus strangled him in his bath. Commodus's death ended the Antonine line and hurled Rome into the bloody civil wars of the Year of the Five Emperors. By the way, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I would greatly appreciate it if you could show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you. Diocletian, born as Gaius Valerius Diocles, rose from humble origins in Dalmatia to become Roman emperor in 284 CE, ruling from his court in Nicomedia. He inherited an empire fractured by crisis and set out to restore stability with sweeping reforms. In 293 CE, he introduced the Tetrarchy, a rule of 4 emperors, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, meant to divide power and strengthen control over Rome's vast territories. He reorganized provinces into dioceses and prefectures and separated military from civil authority, laying the groundwork for a more resilient imperial structure. But in 303 CE, Diocletian became infamous for the Great Persecution. Urged by his Caesar, Galerius, he issued edicts ordering churches destroyed, scriptures burned, and Christians stripped of legal rights. Those who refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods faced imprisonment, torture, or execution. On May 1st, 305 CE, Diocletian did what no emperor before him had done. He voluntarily abdicated power, retiring to his palace in Dalmatia. His reforms stabilized the empire for a time, but his persecution left a darker legacy, remembered as Rome's most violent assault on Christianity, Elagabalus. In the year 218 CE, a 14-year-old from Syria named Elagabalus seized the Roman throne, ruling until 222 CE. Born in Emesa, he was thrust into power after the assassination of his cousin Caracalla, his rise engineered by his grandmother, Julia Maesa. From the very start, his reign stunned Rome. Elagabalus brought with him the cult of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, elevating it above Jupiter, the chief deity of Rome. He built the Elagabalium on the Palatine Hill, transferring Rome's most sacred relics, even the eternal fire of Vesta, into this new temple. His actions scandalized the empire. He took the title of high priest, paraded the sacred black stone of Emesa through the streets, and even married a Vestal virgin, claiming their union would produce divine children. Inside the palace, rumors of extravagance and bizarre excess spread quickly, fueled by hostile accounts from senators and historians who despised him. By 222 CE, the discontent was impossible to contain. His grandmother turned her support to his cousin, Severus Alexander. The Praetorian Guard betrayed him, killing both Elagabalus and his mother. Their bodies were dragged through the streets, mutilated, and thrown into the Tiber River. Condemned by the Senate and erased from monuments, Elagabalus's brief rule remains one of Rome's most infamous chapters. Andronikos I Komnenos ruled Byzantium from 1183 to 1185, a short but infamous reign marked by both reform and terror. Rising to power after years of exile and intrigue, he promised to end corruption and curb the dominance of the aristocracy. He banned the sale of offices, punished officials for abuses, and sought to restore discipline in the empire. But his reforms came with ruthless purges. Nobles and rivals were arrested, tortured, or executed in public spectacles meant to spread fear. His anti-Latin stance reached a breaking point in April 1182, when mobs in Constantinople massacred thousands of Western Europeans, an atrocity that destroyed relations with the West. By 1185, disaster struck. Norman forces from Sicily captured Thessalonica, and revolt spread in Constantinople. Isaac Angelus rose against him, and the people turned violently on their emperor. Andronikos was captured, dragged through the streets, tortured, and killed on September 12, 1185. Once hailed as a reformer, he is remembered instead as a ruler whose brutality and disastrous policies helped push Byzantium into deeper decline. Phocas ruled Byzantium from 602 to 610 CE, remembered as one of the empire's darkest emperors. Once a centurion, he seized the throne in November 602 after leading a mutiny that toppled Emperor Maurice. Maurice and his sons were executed, a brutal purge that announced Phocas's reign with blood. In Constantinople, his rule soon turned despotic. The Senate, clergy, and army grew hostile as he relied on violence and fear to maintain power. Beyond the capital, his inept leadership sparked catastrophe. In the east, Khosrow II of Persia used Maurice's murder as a pretext for war, launching the Byzantine-Sasanian conflict of 602 to 628. Persian armies swept deep into Byzantine lands, capturing key cities. Meanwhile, in the Balkans, Avar and Slavic raids intensified, leaving the empire besieged on all fronts. By 608, revolt rose in Africa under Heraclius the Elder, and his son led a fleet toward Constantinople. In October 610, Heraclius entered the capital, overthrew Phocas, and had him executed. His brief but disastrous reign left the empire weakened, opening the door to decades of foreign invasion and internal struggle. Justinian II, known as the Slit-Nosed, ruled the Byzantine Empire twice, first from 685 to 695, and again from 705 to 711. His reign began with ambition and reforms, but his despotic temperament and notorious cruelty soon overshadowed his accomplishments. Heavy taxation and harsh punishments bred resentment, while his chief eunuch, Stephen the Persian, carried out brutal acts that deepened public outrage. In 695, a revolt erupted. Justinian was overthrown, his nose was cut off to mark him unfit for rule, and he was exiled. Yet a decade later, against all odds, he returned, backed by foreign allies including the Bulgarians, and stormed into Constantinople in 705. His comeback was soaked in vengeance. He executed rivals and unleashed violent reprisals on those who had betrayed him. But his cruelty only isolated him further. By 711, his enemies struck once more. A rebellion ended his rule, and this time, Justinian II was executed. His dramatic fall closed the Heraclian dynasty, leaving behind a legacy of brutality, obsession with power, and one of the most infamous comebacks in imperial history. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, ruled from 221 to 210 BCE. From his capital at Xianyang, he brought an end to the warring states era, conquering rival kingdoms and uniting China under a single throne. His rule introduced sweeping reforms: a standardized writing system, uniform weights and measures, a common currency, and vast networks of roads to bind his empire together. But his vision of order was enforced through fear. In 213 BCE, following the advice of his chancellor Li Si, Qin Shi Huang ordered the burning of books that challenged legalist authority, sparing only works on agriculture, medicine, and divination. The following year, accounts tell of hundreds of scholars, later said to be around 460, executed or buried alive for defying imperial doctrine, though historians debate the exact details. Meanwhile, millions of laborers were forced into monumental projects, building defensive walls that formed the first version of the Great Wall, digging canals, and constructing his massive mausoleum guarded by the Terracotta Army. Qin Shi Huang sought power and even immortality, but his relentless rule left a legacy remembered as both the foundation of a unified China and an empire built on terror. Wu Zetian, born in 624, rose from a concubine in the Tang court to become the only female emperor in Chinese history. She declared herself ruler of a new dynasty, the Zhou, and reigned from 690 to 705. Her path to power was marked by ruthless ambition. Rivals at court were exiled, executed, or quietly eliminated by her secret police. Even members of the imperial family were not spared, as she removed anyone who threatened her authority. Yet her rule was not defined by terror alone. Wu Zetian strengthened the imperial bureaucracy, expanding the civil service examinations to allow men of talent, not just aristocratic birth, to rise in government. She supported agriculture, eased taxes, commissioned public works, and elevated Buddhism as a state religion. Under her reign, China's influence reached deep into Central Asia and Korea, while culture and scholarship thrived. Her reign ended in 705 after a palace coup forced her abdication, restoring the Tang dynasty. Wu Zetian left behind a reign both feared and admired, a legacy that still divides historians. Was she a tyrant who ruled through blood, or a visionary leader who reshaped China's empire? Hongwu Emperor. Born as Zhu Yuanzhang in 1328, he rose from a poor orphan and Buddhist novice to become the founding emperor of the Ming dynasty. In 1368, after defeating the Mongols and rival warlords, he proclaimed himself the Hongwu Emperor and made Nanjing his capital, ruling until he died in 1398. His reign began with sweeping reforms. He issued the Great Ming Code in 1397, reorganized government into 6 direct ministries, and created the Weisuo system that tied military service to farming. These measures strengthened central control and rebuilt a devastated China. But Hongwu's rule was also marked by terror. In 1380, he accused Chancellor Hu Weiyang of treason, executing him along with 30,000 others, and abolished the chancellery altogether. In 1390, he turned on Li Shanchang, eliminating him and tens of thousands more. 3 years later, in the Lan Yu case, another 15,000 lives were taken. These purges, known as the 4 major cases, claimed the lives of tens of thousands, perhaps 100,000 in total. The Hongwu Emperor built a dynasty that would last nearly 3 centuries, but he left behind a legacy of both stability and fear, founding China's last great native dynasty through reforms and through blood. Emperor Yang of Sui, born 569, reigning from 604 to 618 CE, presided over a dynasty that shone briefly before collapsing under the weight of his ambition. He poured vast resources into monumental works. The most famous was the Grand Canal, linking northern and southern China. It was completed with the labor of nearly 1 million conscripts, and reports say that half or more perished from exhaustion, disease, and brutal conditions. He also ordered major reconstructions of the Great Wall and the eastern capital Luoyang, each project driving his people deeper into misery. But Yang's ambition reached beyond his borders. In 612, he launched an invasion of Goguryeo, mobilizing over 1 million soldiers. At the Battle of Salsu, his army of 305,000 men was lured into a trap. Only about 2,700 returned alive. The catastrophic losses, combined with heavy taxes and forced labor, ignited massive rebellions across the empire. By 618, his dynasty was collapsing, and Yang himself was assassinated in a coup led by Yuan Huaji. His reign, marked by vision and destruction, left the Sui in ruins and opened the way for the Tang dynasty. Qianlong Emperor reigned over Qing China from 1735 to 1796, guiding the dynasty to its greatest territorial reach. But behind the splendor of his long rule lay one of the bloodiest campaigns in imperial history. In the 1750s, Qianlong turned his armies against the Dzungar Khanate in Central Asia. What began as a campaign to secure China's northwestern frontier escalated into a near-total extermination. Between 1755 and 1758, as much as 70 to 80% of the Dzungar population perished, killed in battle, executed under imperial orders, or lost to smallpox. Entire communities vanished, their lands left desolate. By 1759, the Qing had absorbed Xinjiang, repopulating the emptied steppe with Han, Hui, Uyghur, and other settlers, and founding new cities like Urumqi and Yining. Qianlong proclaimed this a triumph, presenting the empire as a unified multi-ethnic state. Yet his legacy remains contested, celebrated for cultural patronage and prosperity, but remembered also as the architect of an 18th-century genocide that reshaped the peoples of Inner Asia forever. Genghis Khan, born as Temujin, united the Mongol tribes in 1206 and declared himself Great Khan. Over the next 2 decades, until he died in 1227, his armies carved an empire stretching from China to Eastern Europe. His campaigns were marked not only by brilliant strategy, but also by the calculated use of terror. Cities that resisted were annihilated. At Nishapur in 1221, after a Mongol commander was killed, the entire population was massacred, with chroniclers claiming hundreds of thousands were put to death. That same year at Merv, medieval sources recorded an even greater slaughter, estimates ranging from 700,000 to more than 1 million lives lost. Such mass killings were not random brutality, but deliberate tools of conquest, designed to break resistance before it began. Yet amid the devastation, Genghis Khan also forged a disciplined military system and secured vast trade routes. His legacy endures as both a ruthless destroyer and the architect of an empire that reshaped the course of Eurasian history. Aurangzeb Alamgir, the 6th emperor of the Mughal Empire, ruled from 1658 until his death in 1707, commanding one of the largest empires in Indian history. His reign, however, is remembered as much for its conquests as for the deep fractures it left behind. In 1679, Aurangzeb reimposed the jizya tax on non-Muslims, a levy that had been abolished more than a century earlier by Akbar. He also issued orders for the destruction of major temples, most notably the Vishwanath Temple in Varanasi in 1669 and the Kesava Deo Temple in Mathura in 1670. Even late in his reign, in 1705, he commanded the demolition of the Vithoba Temple at Pandharpur, further inflaming religious divisions. While Aurangzeb expanded Mughal power to its greatest territorial extent through nearly constant warfare, his campaigns drained the treasury and weakened the empire's foundations. His rigid sectarian policies provoked resistance from the Marathas, Sikhs, Rajputs, and Satnamis, sparking rebellions that destabilized his rule. By the time Aurangzeb died in 1707, the empire stood vast but unstable, its unity shattered, its resources depleted, and its decline already set in motion. Napoleon Bonaparte, crowned Emperor of the French in 1804, ruled until 1814 and returned briefly during the 100 Days of 1815. Rising from general to ruler, he reshaped Europe through sweeping reforms and unrelenting war. His Napoleonic Code of 1804 transformed civil law across much of the world, but it was his military campaigns that defined him. At Austerlitz in December 1805, Napoleon achieved one of history's greatest battlefield victories, defeating the armies of Austria and Russia. Yet his ambition knew no limits. In 1812, he invaded Russia with a massive army, only to see it collapse in the bitter winter retreat from Moscow. 2 years later, his defeat at Leipzig in October 1813 forced his abdication and exile to Elba. He escaped in 1815, returning to power for a final stand, but was decisively crushed at Waterloo on June 18. Exiled far across the seas to St. Helena, Napoleon died there on May 5, 1821. He endures as both a master strategist and an authoritarian emperor whose relentless wars left Europe scarred in blood. Emperor Hirohito, known posthumously as Emperor Showa, reigned over Japan from December 25, 1926 until his death on January 7, 1989. His rule spanned one of the most turbulent eras in modern history. During the 1930s and 1940s, Japan embarked on a path of militarist expansion. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931, the brutal Second Sino-Japanese War beginning in 1937, and the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 that brought the United States into World War II. Under Hirohito's reign, Japanese forces committed mass atrocities across Asia, including the Nanjing Massacre and the widespread use of forced labor and chemical weapons. While evidence shows he was briefed on military operations and approved key decisions, Hirohito was shielded from prosecution after Japan's surrender in 1945. General Douglas MacArthur and Allied authorities retained him as a constitutional monarch to stabilize post-war Japan, transforming him into a symbolic figurehead. Yet historians remain divided. Some argue he was a powerless sovereign swept along by militarist leaders, while others, citing wartime documents, contend he exercised real authority and bears responsibility for Japan's aggression. His 6-decade reign remains one of the most contested legacies of the 20th century. Jean Bedel Bokassa seized power in the Central African Republic, and in December 1976 declared himself emperor of the new Central African Empire. On December 4, 1977, he staged a coronation modeled on Napoleon's, spending more than $20 million, around a third of his country's annual budget, while most of his people lived in poverty. His rule was marked by violent repression. On April 19, 1979, security forces massacred over 100 schoolchildren protesting mandatory uniforms tied to Bokassa's family business, with reports that he personally beat some of the students to death. International outrage followed, and France, once his supporter, turned against him. In September 1979, French paratroopers launched a coup, restoring former President David Dacko and abolishing the empire. Bokassa's short reign remains infamous for its grotesque excess and brutal violence. Moctezuma II reigned over the Aztec Empire from 1502 until 1520, ruling from the capital of Tenochtitlan, today's Mexico City. His reign saw the empire at its peak, with vast tribute networks and ritual practices that reinforced power but also stirred resentment among subject peoples. In 1519, the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés arrived. Accounts differ. Some describe Moctezuma as cautious and pragmatic. Others suggest he believed the strangers fulfilled ancient prophecies. What is certain is that he welcomed Cortés into Tenochtitlan, a decision that soon left him a hostage in his own palace. By May 1520, Spanish forces massacred Aztec nobles during a festival at the Great Temple, sparking open revolt. Moctezuma attempted to calm his people from a terrace, but stones and darts struck him down. Sources remain divided on his death, whether from those wounds or by Spanish hands seeking to silence him. In the chaos that followed, the Spaniards were driven from the city during the Noche Triste. Within a year, Cortés returned with allies, laying siege to Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma's fall had opened the path to the destruction of the Aztec Empire. Nader Shah, known as the Napoleon of Persia, rose from obscurity to seize power in Iran, ruling from March 1736 until his assassination in June 1747. Founder of the Afsharid dynasty, he built a vast empire through relentless conquest, stretching from the Caucasus to Central Asia and into India. His most infamous triumph came on February 24, 1739 at the Battle of Karnal. With a smaller but disciplined force, he crushed the Mughal army in just hours. Days later, he marched into Delhi. On March 22nd, his troops unleashed terror on the city, massacring tens of thousands. The sack yielded unimaginable wealth, including the Peacock Throne and the Koh-i-Noor diamond, treasures that became symbols of his plunder. In his final years, paranoia and cruelty marked his rule. He turned on allies and commanders, executing many in fits of suspicion. On June 20th, 1747, at Kuchan in Khorasan, his reign ended in blood when his own officers murdered him in his sleep. Nader Shah's legacy endures as that of a brilliant but ruthless conqueror whose ambition left devastation across Asia. If you enjoyed this video, I will be posting more interesting videos on the channel. I'd greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much.